For MFA Incorporated, I'm Julie Harker with Brownfield Ag News, speaking with Dr. Jim White, Director of Livestock Nutrition at MFA Incorporated in Columbia, talking about protecting cattle during the heat of summer.
Certainly this time of year, we see a fair amount of heat stress. The temperature is high, the humidity is high. It's difficult for the animals to cool themselves. Cattle will have a range of temperature where they won't expend energy to either cool themselves or to heat themselves. Depending on the situation, that's anywhere from say 35 degrees Fahrenheit to maybe 66, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But when temperatures are over that, they're expending energy to cool themselves. So to effectively reduce the amount of maintenance requirement we have for those hot animals, we'll initially try to ensure that they have adequate shade. Probably the best value for money on heat abatement is shade. Shade that's effective. Particularly, we'll see some shade systems where during the course of the day, the shade moves outside of the area that the animals can get to. So the shade is very, very effective in reducing the solar radiation on the animal and reducing the heat stress on the animal. It's relatively quick and dirty to demonstrate that yourself by putting a thermometer in the shady area and then a thermometer in the not shaded area, and you can demonstrate that difference in gradient. A mature cow will produce more heat than what a hairdryer will run in full blast. So she has a fair amount of heat that she needs to remove when the temperatures get up. And as the humidity increases, it becomes more and more stressful as the temperature also increases. There's a measurement called the THI, the Temperature Humidity Index, which we use to measure that, many times commonly reported with the weather reports. In addition to the shade, we need to ensure that they have adequate water. Cows will drastically increase their water consumption when it's hot. They need that water to cool themselves. If we're able to exclude the animals from standing in the water, defecating in the water, that is very helpful for any number of reasons, both from a hygiene perspective, a palatability perspective, and also a consumption perspective. We'd like to see at least 3-4 linear inches of water space in troughs or tanks to the animal. With regard to the forage, we know that we have a lot of fescue here in Missouri. Much of that fescue is endophyte infected. We have seen that endophyte infected forage has a tendency to make heat stress worse. In cows, the alkaloids have a tendency to constrict the blood vessels, and the animals tend to be hotter. If we're able to use different forages, that's helpful in reducing the amount of stress on the animals.
So, Dr. White, what other forages are best to be fed during these times of high heat?
Well, that's a good question, in that a lot of times we're in a situation where we're going to use what we have. So with that caveat off the table, if you got to use whatever you wanted, if I had a magic button, so to speak, and punch away, you'd use those forages that weren't endophyte infected, or you were using a novel endophyte, and those that had very high forage digestibility. Forage digestion tends to increase the heat increment on cattle, which in the winter works great because it helps keep them warm. But we would be looking at very digestible forages. So legumes that are young would be certainly an option. If I had either alfalfa or clover, any of the small grains, that would be taken young. Many times we don't see those small grain crops, wheat, barley, oat put up at boot, because when it was in the boot, I couldn't get into the fields. It wasn't conducive to harvest, so that can be a challenge. But for the rough rule of thumb is that to help on heat abatement from a forage perspective, I stay away from infected fescue, and I use the forage that has the highest forage digestibility. Activity levels are going to be able to influence the animal's heat load. We would like to not handle animals during the late afternoon, say early morning, let's say mid-morning at 9, 10 o'clock until after sunset. The other thing is that the temperatures will tend to be the highest in the afternoon, and it takes a while for that animal to cool down. So just because the sun's down doesn't mean that the animals cool down. A lot of times the animals will have the least heat stress at first light. They'll want to go through that morning feeding bout, and that time frame seems to be when the animals have the most likelihood of regaining their thermal control, in that it's before today's heat has built up, and it's after yesterday's has dissipated. But we would like to not handle animals during high temperature times.
I was going to ask you about the shade. I think in the portable shading systems, is that a good value for the money, and what should those be used?
Yeah, where I can use them, I like them. In some situations we can't use them. What I've seen is that they'll vary a lot on their length of life and their durability. Where they're used well, they're good. They're tremendous value for money. Sometimes the longevity isn't what we would expect. For the most part, to be effective, that shade has to be at least 50% solid. Shade cloth, 80-90% shade cloth works great. There's an industry in and of itself of evaluating shade and putting up shades and how they should be oriented. For the most part, when we orient those shades, we want to make sure that the shade doesn't move outside of where the animals are going to be. So for the most part, a north-south orientation seems to work fairly well. But one challenge with using trees in the hedgerows as shade is that sometimes, depending on what side of the fence the animals are on, shade is there or not there. So that can be an issue. But one challenge with shade sometimes is that some shades, particularly solid shades, will cause puddling in lots, because not only does it shade, but it has rain runoff. And now I got big puddles in certain areas. That may or may not be an issue. But when we're looking at shade, there's any number of considerations to look at as to the cost, as to what our objective is.
That's MFA Director of Livestock Nutrition, Dr. Jim White. For MFA Incorporated, I'm Julie Harker on Brownfield.